You think you remember Family Matters clearly. I used to think so too. A really warm family sitcom, really familiar, really classic old Friday Night America. A house in Chicago, a cop, dad, a mom who keeps the household together, a few kids, a few arguments, a few laughs. That was the trap. Because the deeper I dug, the more I realized Family Matters was never as well behaved as our memories make it seem. This show is packed with characters who just vanish behind the scenes stories that are strange and a little sad, and turning points big enough to drag the whole series into a completely different life. And there are some truths that once you know them, you will never look at Family Matters the same way again. To put it right, this is not just a memorable sitcom. This is one of the strangest cases in late 20th century American television. And here are 20 facts that prove it. Number 20. Urkel was both the savior and the destroyer of Family Matters. If you asked me what the strangest hard turn in American sitcom history was, I would bring up Steve Urkel right away. He was originally written as a one-time guest character. Just one time. But the audience reaction was so huge that the producers had no choice but to keep Urkel around and turn him into a regular. From that moment on, Family Matters was no longer moving down its original path. And then, everything escalated in a way only Golden Age American television could come up with. Urkel was not just popular, he exploded into a full-blown pop culture craze. They sold talking dolls, trading cards, posters, books, lunchboxes, t-shirts, and even a limited edition cereal called Urkel O's. At one point, pretty much every script was forced to include at least some Urkel. The Los Angeles Times even called that phenomenon the Urkelization of Family Matters. But here is the part that is both sad and bitter. By the time the show ended in 1998, Jaleel White was completely sick of that shadow. In 1999, he said something so intense, nobody forgets it once they hear it. If you ever see me playing that part again, just put a bullet in me and put me out of my misery. That is the rarest contradiction in Family Matters. Urkel saved the show. And then Urkel also made sure it would never be the same again. And behind that storm, the thing that kept that house standing was a very different kind of order. Number 19. The Winslow house was not just acting. They managed the kids like real parents. There is something very unusual about Family Matters that I think the audience felt a long time ago. That Winslow house did not feel like a family just because the script was written well. It felt like a family because on some level, the two adults at the center of that house really did act like parents. Jo Marie Payton and Reginald VelJohnson did not just play the mom and dad on screen. According to the younger cast, once the cameras stopped rolling, those two still pretty much kept those roles. They kept the kids in line, corrected them, kept some order on the set. What I love most is that the kids' real-life parents supported that too. Just think about it in Hollywood, where everything is usually temporary. There was a sitcom running on a kind of discipline that felt old-school family-centered and real. And Reginald really was an old-school dad type. He admitted that working with teenagers sometimes drove him crazy. One time, the kids were playing basketball right on the set, and even after being told to stop, they kept going, so he just walked off. Honestly, that detail makes Carl Winslow feel even more real to me. A TV dad everybody loved getting fed up because the kids were acting up too much. It is funny, sweet, and completely believable. Maybe that is why the Winslow house always felt so warm and steady. No matter how much the show changed outside of it, inside that house, there were adults keeping everything from flying apart. But then again, even that world that seemed so orderly had a few more strange little tricks hidden inside it than people realize. Number 18. You saw this face. More than once. Just not as the same person. If you know Family Matters well enough, there may have been a moment when you suddenly saw a face that looked way too familiar and thought, hold on, have I seen this person before? And yeah, you did. It was Garcelle Beauvais. The funny part is, she did not come back as the same character. She kept showing up, disappearing, then popping back up like a totally different person. In Old and Alone, she was Lulu Steve's wife in a dream. Then, in Scenes from a Mall, she became Garcelle, the woman Eddie tries to flirt with at the mall. Then, in To Be or Not to Be. Part 2, she turned into a different version of Mrs. Winslow in a dream. Then, in A Ham is Born, she came back as actress Nicole Moses. Number 17. Family Matters was originally the story of the Winslow family. This is something a whole lot of people remember wrong about Family Matters, and honestly, I cannot even blame them. Steve Urkel got too big. He got so big he basically swallowed the audience's memory of what this show originally was. Ask somebody now who Family Matters was about, and most people will say right away it was Urkel's show. Sounds reasonable. The only problem is that is not where the show started. At the beginning, Family Matters was the story of the Winslows, of Harriette, of Carl, of Eddie Laura Mother Winslow, and that very familiar rhythm of a black family in Chicago. Before Urkel's high-pitched voice started shaking the whole room, this show lived on very ordinary things. A cop dad exhausted after a long day. A mom trying to keep the house from falling into chaos. A family dinner. A living room where somebody was always coming or going. That was the real skeleton of Family Matters. Number 16. Jaleel White had a hard time. Once Steve Urkel started going through puberty. This is a really strange downside of American sitcoms from back then. The audience looked at the screen and saw Steve Urkel still looking exactly the same. Still those big glasses, still that nasal voice, still that skinny frame like time had stopped outside the Winslow house. But inside those clothes was Jaleel White, a kid who started the show very young and then grew up right in front of all of America. The problem was, he was allowed to grow up in real life, but Urkel basically was not. From what White said later on, he had to deal with puberty while still keeping Urkel looking like the version the audience had locked into their heads. For a while he shaved, every day avoided weight training, and then when his body started changing more noticeably, Urkel's wardrobe had to loosen up, shift, get baggier and more covered up, all just to hide the fact that the kid in the suspenders was becoming a man. It sounds funny, sure, but that is a very real kind of pressure. When a character becomes an icon, the public does not just want the voice or the catchphrase to stay the same. They want to keep the baby face and the awkward little body they loved from the start. Number 15. Mother Winslow. Almost missed the most memorable role of her life. There are some roles where looking back now, I honestly cannot imagine anybody else in them. Mother Winslow is one of those. So hearing that Rosetta Lenoir almost turned down Family Matters sounds like one of those near misses we got lucky did not happen. The reason was pretty simple and very human. Rosetta had a bad experience with an earlier sitcom, and she thought she was already too old to really want the television grind anymore. To put it plainly, she had pretty much closed that door. If things had stopped there, Family Matters still might have become a hit sitcom, but I do not believe it would have had the same warmth, the same season charm, the same way one raised eyebrow could light up a whole scene the way Mother Winslow did. Lucky for the show, Thelma Hopkins did not let that slip away. She was the one who called Rosetta and convinced her to take the role. And sometimes television history changes direction because of one phone call like that. Rosetta did not just take the role to fill space. She stayed for 157 episodes and turned Mother Winslow into a part of the soul of the Winslow family that you just cannot separate from the show. Number 14. When Jaleel White joined the cast, he was not welcomed. If you only go by what you see on screen, you would think Steve Urkel belonged with the Winslow family from the very first second. But in real life, it did not go that smoothly. Jaleel White later admitted that when he first came onto the show, he was not really welcomed. And honestly, that is not that hard to understand. At that point, Family Matters already had its own rhythm. The original cast had been working together long enough to become a real professional family. They had their place, their atmosphere, that very clear feeling that the house already had enough people in it. Then, a new kid walks in. And not only walks in, but very quickly drives the audience completely wild. That is where it gets weird. The new guy has not even had time to settle in, and meanwhile, all of America is already looking at him like he is the biggest star on the show. I have always thought that was both awkward and very real. A room that had been stable suddenly gets somebody who walks in and changes its whole gravity. Not everybody is going to feel comfortable with that right away. Number 13. The real reason. Waldo Faldo disappeared. This is one of those behind-the-scenes secrets the audience sitting at home never got a proper explanation for. All they saw was this 1 week Waldo Faldo was still there, and then suddenly he vanished from Family Matters like he had never walked into that house at all. No decent goodbye scene. No real wrap-up. Only later did Sean Harrison explain what was behind it. He left the show after season 7 because his contract had run out. But the more important part is somewhere else. According to Harrison, Family Matters was dealing with budget cuts at the time, and because of that, the show did not always renew actors' contracts. Sounds dry, but that is the real truth of television. The audience thinks a character disappears because the writers change their minds. A lot of times, that is not it. A lot of times, it is just money. Number 12. Family Matters tricked a whole generation. With its musical memory can be a lot sneakier than we think. Just mention Family Matters, and most viewers instantly hear As Days Go By in their heads. It is basically fused to the Winslow house to Friday night, to that very specific feeling of American sitcoms from back then. The second you hear it, a whole era comes rushing back. Only thing is, that was not the show's first opening theme. The first 5 episodes of Family Matters actually used What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong. Once you hear that, you realize television can play some pretty sneaky games with human memory. The show changed the music early enough, then lived long enough with the second song that a whole generation started believing that was the sound it had from the very beginning. And then collective memory just quietly rewrote history in its own way. What is interesting is that these 2 songs give off totally different feelings. One sounds like it opens the door to a softer, more classic world. The other sounds exactly like the Family Matters people. Remember most warm, close familiar, like you just walked right back into the Winslow living room. That is why I have always thought opening themes matter a lot more than people realize. They do not just introduce the show, they teach the audience how to remember it. Number 11. Michelle Thomas's death was the greatest sadness of Family Matters. There are faces on sitcoms people remember because they were funny. There are other faces that stay longer because every time they show up, they light up the whole frame. Michelle Thomas was one of those rare people who could do both. As Myra, she brought a very specific energy, bright, charming, alive, and with that quality that made you believe the second she walked into a scene, the whole atmosphere changed. Not every actor has that, and even fewer can hold on to it. That is why the story behind Michelle Thomas has always been the saddest part for me when I think about Family Matters. She left the show because of stomach cancer. Not long after the show came to an end, Michelle Thomas passed away that same year when she was only 30 years old. 30 years old. That number by itself is enough to make your heart sink. Because this was not just the loss of a young actress. It was the loss of a person who still had way too much light, way too much left to do, way too much left to enjoy. If Michelle Thomas is part of your good memories too, leave a few words to remember and honor her in the comments before we move into the second half of today's list. Number 10. Family Matters had only 2 people who never disappeared. After 9 seasons and 215 episodes, with way too many people coming and going, some getting replaced, some just fading out and disappearing. If I asked who the faces were that really stayed from start to finish, most people would get it wrong right away. A lot of people would think of Steve Urkel. Makes sense. Other people would guess Harriette, because after all this was supposed to be the Winslow house. But no, the answer is a whole lot quieter. Only Reginald VelJohnson and Kelly Shania Williams appeared in all 215 episodes. In other words, the father and the daughter were the only 2 faces who never left this world even once. Number 9. Jamie Foxworth lost 7 auditions before she became Judy Winslow. There are roles that look so effortless on screen, like that kid just naturally belonged in that house from the start. But old television was usually not that simple. Jamie Foxworth later said she had to audition 7 times before she finally got the role of Judy Winslow. 7 times. That number alone tells you the door into Family Matters did not open easily for that little girl. What is interesting is that this detail also explains something a lot of viewers only noticed later. In the very first episode, Judy was not played by Jamie Foxworth. She was played by another actress, Valerie Jones, which means right from the beginning, the role of the youngest Winslow daughter was never as steady as most people remember it being. On screen, viewers just saw a little girl in the family. Behind the curtain, it was a whole process of trying changing, and only then locking it in. Number 8. Family Matters actually changed the mother's face near the end. There are characters in a sitcom who are not just characters, they are the rhythm of the house. And Harriette Winslow was that kind of person. She was not loud like Urkel. She did not have a catchphrase the whole country repeated, but she was the center that made the Winslow house still feel like a family. So, when Family Matters reached the final stretch, and that mother's face suddenly changed, the audience did not just feel surprised, it felt like a real jolt. Jo Marie Payton left the series in the middle of season 9, and her last episode was episode 200. For the final 9 episodes, Judy-Ann Elder took over the role of Harriette. Later on, this usually gets retold in a way that is way too neat, like Payton left, only because she got tired of Urkel overshadowing everything. But she herself said, real life was not that simple. She had wanted to leave for quite a while, before that felt creatively boxed in, wanted to do something else, and was also going through a very heavy time in her personal life because of a divorce. Number 7. The famous Did I Do that was born out of improvising. Most viewers remember Steve Urkel through something that is practically burned into collective memory. Did I do that? It sounds so smooth that everybody assumes that line must have been written perfectly from the start, like the second they put it in Urkel's mouth, history was made. But no. The real story is a lot stranger than that. According to Jaleel White, the team tried out a bunch of different versions before that line finally settled in as the trademark. In other words, one of the most famous catchphrases in American sitcom history did not show up as one perfect lightning bolt from the writer's room. It got shaped little by little, tested little by little, heard little by little. And only then did it become what it became. And the strangest part is right there. The reaction from the studio audience helped lock that line into place. Not just the writers, not just the actor. The whole room helped forge it. Number 6. The Family Matters house showed up in another show. If you are just sitting at home watching, you think every sitcom lives in its own world, with its own house, its own rhythm, its own life. But behind the screen, things are more practical and a lot more interesting. The pilot of Living Single in 1993 actually used the Family Matters house set. Same space, same feeling, just dressed up with a different life, a different rhythm of dialogue, a different soul. In other words, It is not just actors who move from one show to another. Sometimes the house does too. And funny enough, it was not only the set of this show that had another life outside what viewers saw. Some of the faces at the center of that house get even more interesting the more you learn about their real lives. Television really is a sweet kind of magic trick. Number 5. The Man Who Played. This beloved TV. Dad had never been married. If you grew up with Family Matters, it is hard not to believe Carl Winslow was a real father. He had that tired look of a man who worked all day and still had to come home and clean up the chaos in the living room. He had the strictness, the perfectly timed yelling, and also the warmth of a father who loved his kids without spoiling them. Reginald VelJohnson played that role so solidly that viewers stopped seeing him as an actor. They saw him as the pillar of the whole house. And then, real life steps in and suddenly makes everything even more interesting. Reginald VelJohnson in real life has never been married and does not have children. That fact alone is enough to make this memorable, because it means one of the most believable television fathers of an entire generation never actually lived the life he made millions of viewers believe came so naturally to him. That is the sweet magic of old Hollywood. No showing off, no flexing technique, just an actor stepping into the frame, and all of a sudden, all of America believes he could be their dad. Number 4. Family Matters. Outlived the show that gave birth to it. A side character steps in from the edge of the frame, nobody thinks they are going to go that far, and then a few years later, they look back and realize they lasted longer than the place that gave them life. Family Matters is one beautiful case of exactly that. A lot of people remember Family Matters as a big family sitcom, like it had always been standing there from the start. But really, Harriette Winslow was first just a character on Perfect Strangers, an elevator operator, not the kind of role people usually point at and say, "Oh yeah, that is going to be the seed for a whole television empire." Then, American television did what it did best in that era. It spotted something small that had real life in it, then let that thing grow into a whole tree of its own. Number 3. The Real Life Family. Matters House was wiped out. There are sitcom symbols that do not need to say a word, and viewers still recognize them right away. With Family Matters, one of those symbols is the house that shows up in the opening. The second you see that front view, you know you have come back to the right place, the right world, that very familiar feeling of the Winslow house. It is like a greeting that does not need words. And that is exactly why the real-life truth makes people stop short. That house was at 1516 West Wrightwood Avenue in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago. It was sold in December 2016 for $798,000. After that familiar house was replaced by a 3-story condo building with units listed for more than $1 million each. In other words, one of the warmest images in American family television got swallowed up by the real world. Number 2. Steve and Laura. Almost had a wedding. The audience never got to see. For years now, people have kept passing around the story that if Family Matters had gotten a season 10, Steve and Laura very likely would have made it to a wedding. Just hearing that is enough to make a lot of people feel a little sting, because it is exactly the kind of ending that sounds so right, so perfectly timed that it almost wants to turn itself into a real memory. And that is what makes it interesting. That wedding was never filmed. There is no episode to rewind. There is no frame you can point to and say, "Here, this is where it happened." But in the minds of fans, it still lives on like something that absolutely should have happened. Because after all those years of chasing, teasing, waiting, missing each other, then circling back again, Steve and Laura had stopped being just a sitcom couple. They had become a promise the audience had been carrying for way too long. But even that almost happened twist was not the biggest turn Family Matters almost took. Because at the last spot on this list, is a turn even crazier than that. A direction where if it had really happened, the whole show probably would have stepped into a completely different life. Number 1. Family Matters. Almost swerved from family sitcom into a cop show. Now this is the turn that makes me feel like Family Matters really was a show that never wanted to end in a normal way. You would think by the last season the light in the Winslow house was almost out for good. But no. Right near the end of its life, this show still almost transformed itself one more time, and this time not with a new character or another one of Urkel's wild ideas, but with a completely different direction. The producers had considered making a police series centered on Eddie Winslow once he became a cop, with Carl Winslow appearing as a recurring character. Just imagining that already feels strange. One little shift further, and Eddie would not have just been the son in that house anymore. He could have stepped out of the Winslow living room, put on the uniform, and pulled the whole world of Family Matters into another orbit, more grown up, tougher, colder. But American television is always cold in exactly the coldest places. The ratings in the final season fell too low, and that door slammed shut before it ever had the chance to open. So the second life of Family Matters died right there as an idea. So that is the whole trip, and it was a beautiful one, a strange one, and honestly one that fits the spirit of Golden Age American television perfectly. Family Matters was never just a sitcom you turned on and laughed at for a few minutes and then forgot. It was an old house in memory, a place with opening music, a gruff father with a warm heart. Faces we thought would stay there forever, and behind the scenes, stories that get sadder, stranger, and more unforgettable the deeper you dig. Which fact on today's list hit you the hardest or touched your memory the most? Tell me down in the comments. This channel is still small right now, and honestly, that is something I like, because it means I can still read almost every comment you leave. So do not be shy about sharing. And if you love digging back into classic shows like this, do subscribe and stick with me for the next lists.